So, welcome everyone. My name is John Locke. I'm the Dean of the School of Engineering here at the George Washington University, and I have the honor of welcoming you all here for this very exciting event. As you can see from the names on the screen here and in that video, we really have sort of legends in the field who have helped shape technology and computing and communications in a way that's still impacting all of us today. And so really excited to be here and to be hosting it here at the George Washington University. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our sponsors and partners, and a special thank you to the National Science and Technology Medals Foundation for hosting the event with us here at the George Washington University. So I'll let the next few speakers introduce the event and our esteemed panelists. But just a few quick words about why I feel like it's so appropriate to be having this conversation tonight that we're going to be seeing here at the George Washington University. So George Washington actually himself was an innovator, was an engineer, did a lot of pioneering work in surveying and farm equipment, and of course, he always had an eye on social impact and public policy and all those things as well. And so the impact that he had, back in the 18th century, obviously, we're still feeling today. And now here in the 21st century, this wonderful university that bears the name of George Washington is continuing to innovate and impact society in a variety of really important ways. In fact, an important note, the president of the George Washington University, Tom LeBlanc, is actually a computer scientist himself. When I mentioned this event to him, he got excited and talked about, how he looked up to all of these people here too, as he was a student of computer science and doing some pioneering work himself in parallel computing and operating systems and whatnot. One of the other things, too, that President LeBlanc actually talked to me about as he was recruiting me to GW just this past spring was about how GW is really leading at that intersection of technology and policy and media. And something that I feel is so important, one of the specific examples he provided for that is the new Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics that has been established here at the George Washington University as a result of a grant from the Knight Foundation. It was a competitive grant process. GW was one of only 5 schools that were selected for these major investments, and it's really about people in the engineering school who are studying machine learning, artificial intelligence, data analytics, partnering with these world experts in public policy and media studies to really understand how data, disinformation, deep fakes, all these other kinds of things, social media, are impacting our democracy today. Obviously, a really, really important problem that really, sits at that intersection of technology and society. Really important work. Something else that we're particularly proud of here that I know also relates to what to the broad mission of the National Science and Technology Medals Foundation is our emphasis on diversity and inclusion here with respect to engineering education. One of the things we're particularly proud of, and that again drew me here to GW, is that 40% of our undergraduate engineering students are women, which is over twice the national average. So this is something great. Thank you. I appreciate that. So it's something that we're particularly proud of. And in fact, our moderator tonight, Shelly Heller, is the director of our Center for Women in Engineering. And it's really a pioneering center that not only is creating a fantastic environment for women and other underrepresented groups in engineering here at GW, but is really kind of coming up with some innovative techniques that we are going to then partner with other universities to really create some diversity, inclusion, and quality in engineering education and really in the field of engineering. So again, welcome to GW. Really excited to have you here. I'm so excited to witness the event here myself as a computer engineer. So now please join me in welcoming our next speaker, the Deputy Director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, Laura Peter.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. It is my honor and pleasure to be here and greet you today. I'd like to ask all of you to imagine a world without the internet. For the many students in the audience, this may be hard to do. You've only known a world in which a quick hello to a friend or relative or a post on social media is as easy to do as a few quick keystrokes or a touch of the screen. But for the rest of us, our lives have become inextricably linked. And for good reason. The internet has allowed us all to leverage the vast sum of human knowledge and human relationships to lead us to richer and fuller lives. This is especially true for those of us who live in rural and remote places, so long as they have internet access. If you can connect to the internet, you can register for a class, you can order books, and maybe even actually attend a class. After class, you can order dinner, watch a movie, and then do some late night research. Or you can stream your favorite music or share notes with or a chat with classmates during a study session. You can even take a test and then order a ride to your favorite local establishment for a celebration afterwards. All of this from a single device that fits in your pocket. Think about what makes this happen. All the different systems that rely on different technologies must be able to coordinate their efforts across great distances. This is the genius of the internet. It provides a common platform on which everyone can interconnect. And its design has allowed it to grow organically on a scale that maybe even outpaced the wildest dreams of its founders. The internet has provided rich and fertile ground on which all manner of innovations have sprung and flourished. At the United States Patent and Trademark Office, the USPTO, we examine a whole class of inventions that would likely not exist but for the internet. It's hard to think of another innovation in the last several decades that has changed the way we have lived our daily lives as much as the internet. And it will continue changing our lives as long as new innovations like the Internet of Things continue to build on this incredible technology. So I'm proud to be here today to honor and learn from some of the key architects of the internet, Vint Cerf, Steve Crocker, and Radia Perlman. Origins of the Internet is part of the Science Unscripted program of the National Science and Technology Medals Foundation. This program allows audiences to pull back the curtain on world-changing scientific and technological discoveries to better understand the challenges inherent in innovation process and what it takes to overcome them. The women and men featured at Science's Unscripted events embody the spirit of American innovation in all of its forms, from DNA synthesis to digital photography. The Foundation and the USPTO have worked together many years to honor the recipients of the National Medal of Technology and Innovation and share their stories with their world. Ours is a natural partnership because telling stories of innovators is one of the ways the USPTO fulfills its mission to foster innovation, competitiveness, and economic growth. Now it is my privilege to welcome to the podium Andy Rathman-Noonan, Executive Director of the National Science and Technology Medals Foundation, to introduce this evening's panel. Thank you so much for inviting me here.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming here. Appreciate it. I also want to say thanks to everyone who's tuning in online. We do have a live stream. We do live stream all of our events. As you heard from the director, my name is Andy Rathman-Noonan. I'm the Executive Director of the National Science and Technology Medals Foundation. And I'm thrilled to be here tonight. I hope all of you are thrilled to be here tonight, which I know will be a wonderful discussion between three internet pioneers. I want to thank a few people here. First, I'd like to thank the leadership and staff at GW, putting on an event here, hosting in this beautiful venue. Really appreciate it. It's been a wonder to work with all of you. I also want to specifically thank the GW chapter of ACM. When we do these unscripted events, we always want to partner with a student org, and they've been phenomenal in their support of this program. I do want to thank two agency sponsors, the United States Patent and Trademark Office and the National Science Foundation. With their generous support, we've been able to expand the unscripted series to thousands of attendees and viewers across the country. We've featured over 35 experts, many of them Medal of Science and Medal of Technology and Innovation laureates, and hosted these events at 15 academic institutions since the program was founded in 2017. Our foundation was founded nearly 30 years ago, if you didn't know, and many of you probably didn't, and it was based around a specific belief, that scientific and technological advancements are potent agents of positive change. Our mission then was to simply celebrate the women, men, and companies who are honored with the National Medal of Science and the National Medal of Technology and Innovation, also known as the nation's highest STEM honors. But in the last 5 years, our foundation has expanded and evolved dramatically. We've expanded to address a specific social imperative. Today, we not only celebrate STEM excellence, we also advocate for the creation of inclusive, diverse, and equitable STEM communities and the tangible benefits they have had on scientific and technological progress. Tonight, you're going to hear from three individuals whose impact on science and technology cannot be overstated. But they, like many of the other guests that have been featured in our science unscripted programs, once sat where many of the students in this crowd have sat, wondering how they're going to get all of it done. I know many of you are going through midterms right now, wondering if they're ever going to get through that midterm. Who are they going to turn to it for advice? What's the next step in their career? Those are questions that are universal. They're questions that the people you're going to hear from tonight asked. And we hope that in that process, you'll all get an understanding of what their journey looked like to success. Tonight, we want to take you back to the origins of the internet, examining the leap from the Arpanet to a broadly available network. We're going to examine how our relationship with the internet grew and changed in the decades since. And we're going to want to explore what comes next. And so tonight, what better way to do that with the three individuals we have here tonight? Our first guest is Dr. Vint Cerf. Dr. Cerf is known as a co-architect of the internet, for which he and Bob Kahn designed the TCP/IP protocol. He received the 1997 National Medal of Technology from President Clinton. He's also received the Turing Award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and many more accolades for his contributions as an internet pioneer and a promoter of security technologies. Since 2005, Dr. Cerf has served as Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google, and we're honored that he also serves as a board member for our foundation. Our second guest tonight is Dr. Radia Perlman. Dr. Perlman is currently a fellow at EMC Dell. Dr. Perlman's breakthroughs have helped to enable today's linked state routing protocols to be robust, scalable, and easy to manage. Her design in the 1980s to route IP continues to flourish today, as well as her spanning tree algorithm that transformed Ethernet from the original limited scalability into a protocol that can handle large clouds. She has authored countless books, as well as co-authored textbooks, and has taught courses at the University of Washington, Harvard University, and MIT. Our third guest tonight is Dr. Steve Crocker. Dr. Crocker has been involved in the internet since its inception. He was part of the team that developed the protocols for the Arpanet and laid the foundation for today's internet. He organized the Network Working Group, which was the forerunner of the modern Internet Engineering Task Force. He initiated the request for comment series of notes through which protocol designs are documented and shared. From 2002 to 2007, he was heavily involved in ICANN as the founding chair of the Security and Stability Advisory Committee and as a member of the ICANN board. And then leading our discussion tonight, and we're thrilled to have her here, is Dr. Shelly Heller. Dr. Heller is a research professor here at George Washington University and an expert in the impact of computers in educational settings. Through her research and role as the director of the Elizabeth Summers Women's Leadership Program, Dr. Heller has championed a long-standing effort to bring and retain women in STEM. We're grateful for her insight, and we're incredibly pleased that she's going to be guiding our discussion. So why don't you join me as we welcome them, all four of them to the stage.
Thank you.
We're
Okay,
on.
all set? Great. Well, let me add my sentence. I too am really excited to be here, to get to talk to all of you, the first generation, and to bring the second and then the next generation into the conversation. One of my sons said, "Hey, Mom, you're going to get to nerd out tonight." So here I am, nerding out. Let's start with the start. Why don't we bring the audience up to speed on the origins? Where did it go? And I know you want to say a little bit, Vint, about that with some slides, so
Yes, I
it's
do.
yours.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here along with my colleagues. In case you're wondering, I'm not listening to War and Peace. I happen to wear hearing aids, and this is better quality sound for me to be plugged in this way instead of trying to deal with an echoey auditorium. So let me take you back 50 years ago to, oops, that's not right. Let's try
And
this
you
one.
can
There we
see
go.
it.
You can see it in front.
Yes, you're right. That's helpful too. So 50 years ago, the Arpanet was being put together. Literally on the 29th of October of a couple of weeks from now, we will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the interconnection of the SRI International node of the Arpanet and the UCLA node of the Arpanet, number 1 and number 2. And that first connection between the two host computers at those two locations. The network rapidly expanded. There you see a 4-node network here, but it rapidly expanded. And then its success triggered the invention of the internet that Bob Kahn and I worked on way back in 1973. So as the years passed from 73 to 77, we developed the TCP/IP protocols for 3 different kinds of networks: a mobile packet radio network, which Radio also worked on, the Arpanet itself, which by 1977 had extended all the way into Europe, and a packet satellite network, which connected the west coast of Europe to the east coast of the United States. So the first time we had tested the internet protocols with 3 networks was 22 November 1977. Then, because all of this is now working, the National Science Foundation and others, Department of Energy and NASA, decided to build their own backbone networks consistent with the TCP/IP protocols. NSF was determined to connect 3,000 universities around the United States. They did so with a backbone network and a dozen intermediate level networks. So we had a collection, a network of networks, which is what the internet was intended to demonstrate and implement. So the next thing that happens is that we see a commercial internet, which rapidly expands from about 1989 to the present. You see this multicolor picture. It's simply to tell you that there are hundreds of thousands of networks, each running independently of each other with different business models, different decisions about who they connect to and under what terms and conditions. But it all hangs together thanks to a common set of protocols that they all adhere to. And just to give you a quick glimpse of where we're headed next, we have connectivity by satellite rapidly potentially coming from companies like SpaceX and others that might put several thousand, maybe even 14 or 20,000 satellites in orbit, in low Earth orbit, which means that it might be impossible to escape connectivity to the internet no matter where you were on the planet, because some of these things are in polar orbits, so the North and South Pole will be equal quantities, which they are not today with the satellites that are in equatorial orbit. So tens of thousands of satellites in orbit connecting everybody together. The next thing after that is just to go further into space. There is already operating an interplanetary backbone, which is linking Earth, Mars, and the International Space Station with protocols that were developed starting in 1998, prototyped in 2004 for the 2 rovers that landed, Spirit and Opportunity, and are now standardized by the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems. So now you see a 50-year quick view of the rapid escalation of the internet. And now back to find out what the heck happened at the beginning.
Fair enough, thanks. Thanks for the visuals, for the visual learners, but also thanks for that quick sweep. So Steve, let me ask you, in a word, what were you thinking then?
We were scared. We were excited. Vint and I were among a group of graduate students associated with each of those 4 nodes. And the Arpanet project had this very peculiar schizophrenia, if you will. There was a quite formal, careful plan for how to connect up the nodes to each other. And the routers, the IMPs as they were called at the time, were produced by a professional group at Bolt, Brannick and Newman. And very disciplined and scheduled and measured and so forth. And meanwhile, what we were going to do with this network, what applications and how we were going to use it, was left in a kind of field of dreams fashion for the people who were at these nodes to figure out what to do. So as I said, Vint and I were among the graduate students at UCLA, and we met with our counterparts in the other. Why graduate students? Well, the professors were too busy doing real work was sort of the answer. And I think we were cheaper labor.
Slave labor, yeah.
So we met, and it was pretty exciting, actually. Most of us were relatively experienced at the fundamentals of what computers of the day were like. We knew about operating systems, we knew about programming languages and compilers and so forth, all the basic technology. And we could see the value of connecting these computers together and being able to work together, collaborate, and make use of the disparate resources that were there. Just speaking for myself, without wanting to obligate anybody else or implicate anybody else, it was clear to me that there were straightforward, simple things to do, like being able to remotely log in and move a file. But it was also clear to me that there were going to be a lot more interesting kinds of things, how to get processes to interconnect to each other, how to make use of multiple computers for something. And it was also clear that we did not know how to do that, nor did we even know what all the possibilities were. And so when I say we were scared, I mean it in a somewhat professional sense of knowing that we needed not to have a closed system that we designed completely, but to build a framework that other people could build on. And that was actually an important watchword and permeated both the technical side and I'll call it the social side. On the technical side, the protocol architecture was thin layers that were intended to be extended or even intruded upon by whoever needed to build something. And from the social side, the process for participating in the design of these protocols was deliberately wide open. Anybody could come to meetings, anybody could contribute thoughts, anybody could get the papers that we were writing, and to sort of punctuate, to sort of emphasize that notion, the set of notes that we started were called requests for comments, no matter what degree of formality. They could be very informal or they could be very formal, but we wanted to make sure the door was open instead of closed. And so we had the good fortune in that environment. All of these were ARPA-supported research places, and ARPA at the time had the most advanced computer science research funding, quite different from NSF, which was primarily focused on getting big computers on campus to support the physical sciences, to do kind of classic numerical stuff. Whereas the ARPA program, and I say ARPA as opposed to DARPA because at the time the agency was started, it was within the Office of Secretary of Defense, and then later it got pushed out and made a defense agency, a difference of almost nothing in terms of the substance, but it changed the name. So the focus of the office that we were in was man-machine interaction, artificial intelligence, very, very long vision, very, very insightful. And because of that, the research laboratories themselves were doing pretty interesting things. The artificial intelligence laboratories at MIT, at Stanford, at SRI were all part of the portfolio. Man-machine interaction, Doug Engelbart's work also at SRI, building the mouse and interactive graphics. And quite, I won't go through the full list, but it was quite an exciting portfolio. But it meant that those of us who were connecting these computers together were living in the future that is now available to basically everybody. At the time, these were just single systems within research laboratories, and if you were lucky enough to be there, you'd be using a mouse and you'd be using interactive machines and so forth. And of course, the cost of computers and the capability was nothing like what it is today. So we had a very good picture, just because we were living it in a sense, of what the computing environment should look like. that takes you a certain distance. We could see a lot of things. We could see instantly that if you had a computer, you really would want it to be part of a network. The utility was what you could taste it. Just again, speaking for myself, there were obviously things that we did not anticipate. Google and this Facebook thing and stuff like that. You know, we were into serious work, and so we could see a lot,
Right.
quite far, frankly, but there were quite obviously things that we didn't see. And most importantly, although we could see that you'd want all the computers connected, in those days you could still count all the computers. Datamation ran a survey every year, and it got up to 70,000 computers or 100,000 computers. Personal computers had not yet come along, and smartphones were Dick Tracy science fiction
Wristwatch,
sort of thing,
right, yes.
So the scalability, we could see the scaling, but I don't think we saw it well enough. And with the scaling comes a huge set of problems. And,
So I'm going to get to those problems in 1 second.
and that's my segue to you, Radia.
Super segue. But before you segue, I have to publicly thank you for RFCs and all of my network students in this auditorium. Steve Crocker is the father of the RFC, and he's part of your homework, so pay attention.
Yeah, Shelley described that, and she just publicly thanked me. I'm going to publicly apologize to you.
Hey, smart move. There are over 8,000 something 500 or so of those RFCs now.
And they have to memorize all of them for their midterm, so it'll work very well.
Yeah, it's going to be tough.
So Radia, let me ask you then, how do you bring some sort of organized robustness to what was all of this independent, a bit of these three systems that Vint described, and these new ideas that Steve just talked about? So how do you do that?
Right, so let me comment on a couple of things that you said. So yeah, other standards organizations publish standards. This is what you'll do. I always thought that the term request for comments was so incredibly polite. You know, they're also standards, but yeah.
Well, not all of them.
Not all of them, right. And then the concept of Google. If before Google existed, if I was a venture capitalist and someone said, oh, I have a great idea for a company, we're going to map everything on the internet so you can find anything instantly and it'll be free, I would say, first of all, technically it's impossible, and there's no way that you could fund this thing, so at any rate. So yeah, my dimension to all of this is robustness and manageability. So I sort of hate computers and they hate me. So I'm used to them failing in ways that they wouldn't fail for anyone else. It's just they sort of hate me. So, so the kinds of, I sort of noticed that the original Arpanet routing algorithm, if you just injected a few bad messages, the network would be down forever. And you could reboot your PC, but you can't reboot a network. And the way that you fix a network is sending network management messages on the network, which if it's broken, you're really in trouble. So, you know, the first paper I wrote was, hey, they have to be much more stable than that, and this is how to fix the algorithm to do that. Also, there's ways of, like, if you would like the network to be organized in a certain way, it could partition various links so it's not really organized the way that you think it is. So those were kind of the robustness things. And then in terms of, you know, I barely know how to use a smartphone, and I design things for people like me, that you should just turn it on and it works, you don't have to understand it. So actually, I was at Digital at the time, and we had like real commercial customers. They weren't computer scientists that were going to be using it, it was actual human beings. Which, by the way, so engineers ought to meet these human beings. things, and they wouldn't ask questions like, do you want to display the secure as well as the insecure items? I happen to even know what that means, and it doesn't make any sense. But at any rate, so I was designing things that you just plug it together and it would work. And I had people complain to me, hey, Radia, we have customers that really like to configure things. And I said, fine, they want knobs, I'll give them knobs, but you don't have to touch them. It'll work without it. And even if you start playing with the knobs, any setting will still work. So, these are kind of the dimensions, as well as sort of making things more scalable, that I kind of added.
Oh,
Could
so
I
here's before you go.
make a couple of
Yep, I'm going to ask you,
Yeah.
but I just want to give the audience homework. And your homework is, not now, at home, Google Radia Perlman and Spanning Tree, and you'll get to hear the Spanning Tree song.
That's great.
Fair enough.
So just a few observations.
Sure, please.
First of all, only half the world is currently online as best as we can tell. Although the other half who are not actively using the internet are affected by it, because the other people who are on make decisions and things like that that affect everybody. So that's one point. The second one is that when Steve mentioned that sort of anybody could engage, that's approximately true, although during the period of Arpanet's development and during a good period of Internet's development, the people who were engaged were the ones who were sponsored by government agencies. First it was the Defense Department by DARPA, then DOE and NASA and NSF. And it was only around 1989 that we started seeing commercial access to the internet and more commercial participation in the Internet Engineering Task Force. None of us mentioned the arrival of the World Wide Web, which was a fairly dramatic milestone in the story of the internet. This comes in December of '91, when Tim Berners-Lee introduced the World Wide Web from CERN in Switzerland. Nobody noticed. But a couple of guys at the National Center for Supercomputer Applications, Eric Bina and Mark Andreessen, saw this, got very excited, and decided to build a graphical user interface for the World Wide Web. They called it Mosaic. They made it free and open. They released it. It downloads everywhere. People got very excited because the internet suddenly looked like a magazine. It was formatted text. It was images, eventually streaming audio and video. So the web became an extremely important avenue for public use of the internet, generation and distribution of content. In fact, there was so much of it that it introduced the need for Radia's description of a company that could index the entire World Wide Web and make it available. And indeed, many companies did that. Alta Vista was one of the early applications. Then came Yahoo, then came Google, then came Bing and others. So the web is very important. I want to acknowledge something that Radia did while I was still running the program at DARPA in the late 1970s and early 80s. We were worried that in the military deployment that the network, because of the loss of links, would fragment into pieces. And we needed to show that it could be possible to build it, rebuild it again. So we flew packet radios in Strategic Air Command aircraft and put them on the ground, artificially fragmented the Arpanet, and reconnected it using the Radia's protocols in order to literally reconstitute an otherwise fragmented network. That was a huge contribution from my point of view. Last point on knobs. The packet radio program was designed around the concept of writing software to control a radio rather than a person controlling the radio. So Bob Kahn, who had initiated that particular project, said that one of the requirements was no knobs. He didn't want people to mess around with the radio. It was supposed to manage itself and be robust in the way that Radia has indicated.
Good. Actually, what you just brought up and what Radia mentioned leads me to ask, so you had this thing that you made, and it had 2 nodes and then 10 nodes and then more and more. That's a cool project. But what happens when you bring that cool project? What are the challenges when you bring that cool project to the real world? So you mentioned one with the graphical user interface, and you really, Radia, you mentioned one in how do you make sure it's not going to collapse on everybody all the time? But what are the other challenges? And maybe I'll ask Steve and come down the line a little bit, give you a chance to respond. So what happens when you bring this interesting technology up to scale and you want to make it here in the real world? What are some of the challenges that you see?
So ARPA is the R in ARPA is research. And in principle, a project like this was a research project. One interpretation of research project is that it doesn't have to work all the time, that it get to break and people get to poke fingers in it and do whatever they want. But very quickly, and I have to say to the credit of the people who designed the IMPs and the basic stuff, they intended that it was going to be reliable. They intended that it was going to be there so that it was a platform that other people could use to do their research, but that not in a hardcore sense with specific requirements, but in a general direction of making it a service as opposed to just a research project. And with that orientation, they discovered that the things that they tried to do worked pretty well, but not quite well enough. And they discovered the difference between 90% uptime and 99% uptime and 99.99% uptime. And if it's only like 98 or 99%, which seems phenomenally good, turns out that that's not good enough.
Yeah.
And so there's some anecdotes about people in the team discovering what are the elements, and it's a whole bunch of little things. And you got to go fix one thing that's causing 1% outage and so forth, until it became that it was just there and always worked. And at that point, people started to depend upon it, and they could build applications on top. Email, for example, was something that we didn't anticipate. It was a very humble kind of application, not sort of worthy of any real respect, except that all of a sudden it became the application and everybody was using it prior to the World Wide Web. But the notion of making it stable enough that it actually worked caused it to catch fire. Everybody wanted to be on the network. The network was the Arpanet, and then the network was this interconnection of networks, and but in the academic world, and then finally the commercial world. It took off in a viral way. I think viral wasn't invented. The word wasn't used that way until later, but the critical mass phenomenon, and just amazingly forceful in all the lives. And in universities, I worked for a while at ARPA, and in the early days, the only way you could get on the ARPANET is if we paid for it. And I had a professor, one I knew and respected, called me up one day from a university that we were not supporting, and he said, "I've got to get on the Arpanet, I have the cash, where do I send it?" And an awkward conversation ensued, and it was years before the things were open enough.
So, Radia, what else? What are some of the other challenges?
So I was living comfortably in the distributed algorithms of how computers talk to each other in order to figure out how to move data. And I didn't, when I finally realized the real problems when this stuff hits actual real world at the upper layers. So for instance, with DNS names, do you give a country code to Taiwan?
So I'm going to stop you for a moment.
Oh, okay. Is that
Since
later
we're
question?
nerding out, just tell everybody what DNS stands for.
Oh, right. That's the thing where you look up a name and get an address, and that's how.
Like www.google.com. That's a domain name.
Right.
Small advertising.
But yeah, how do you hand out these names? And well, it's not, like us security people sort of thought that, okay, if I want to talk to my bank, I will magically know their name, and then the protocols will look up the name and find an address, and then there's certificates and all this wonderful stuff, so I know that I'm talking to that. But people don't look things up by name anymore. So for instance, I wanted to renew my license. So I typed into Google, renew Washington State driver's license, and I clicked on the first thing. The name inside this huge, horrible URL thing was WashingtonLicensing.org. looks fine to me. I'm a human. How am I supposed to know that it wasn't the right thing? And it was a completely scam site that asked me for my driver's license and my credit card, and I happily gave it to them until I discovered later on they were making all sorts of charges and not giving me a license. And all 50 states, by the way, there's, Idaho licensing.org and stuff. So yeah, there were all of the issues, like when you have all of these ISPs, all of these networks in different countries, how do you actually make contracts with who's going to route whose data, how much are they going to charge? This is kind of an immensely miraculous thing that somehow it was made to actually work as well as it does.
So before, when we were chatting, you made reference to a political challenge as well. How do you decide who gets the names China and so on and so forth? And how do you decide that? So if you'd say a few words, I think.
Right. So names in general. So who gets the name IBM? Is it like the big tech company, or is it the itty bitty molecule company or something? Then they fight over these names. It's all, it's kind of doesn't work at all, can't possibly work at all, but does somehow work. It's kind of amazing.
So Vint, do you have other examples of challenges where
lots.
Research, lots?
How much time do you have?
I can tell you accurately how much time, but go anyway.
So first of all, with regard to scaling in general, the internet has scaled by a factor of 10 million since it was turned on in 1983, and it's a significant event to have an architecture that can grow at that pace. The second thing is that public access to the internet wasn't available until 1989, when the first commercial internet services were opened up, UUNet, PSINet, and SurfNet in the San Diego area. The consequence of that is that ordinary people got access to the system, and ordinary people turned out to both use and abuse the infrastructure. So today you see a great deal of both constructive, useful applications on the network, people sharing information, often without any intent to monetize that, and other people who are abusing the system by spreading malware, generating denial of service attacks, scamming, and a variety of other really harmful behaviors. And that's a big issue, because those harmful behaviors take place across international boundaries. And so figuring out who is the perpetrator, who the victims are, and in what jurisdiction the problem should be resolved is a non-trivial exercise. The Secretary General of the United Nations opened up a high-level panel on digital cooperation last year. A report was delivered to him in June of this year, and which suggested a series of possible steps to increase cooperation among countries in order to deal with attribution and standards of behavior that could be adopted, and possibly even in treaty form at some point. So there's a lot of challenge here to make this network, this open and incredibly useful network, a safe place to be. There are technical problems, there are legal problems, and there are human behavioral problems, all of which have to be addressed in one form or another. Could I just say one thing about the domain name system? In the earliest stages of the internet, domain names were handed out by our colleague John Postel, who passed away in 1998, for free. They were simply available to people who applied for them, and there wasn't a whole lot of fighting about it. When it came to the question of which country gets a top-level domain, Postel brilliantly said, I don't want to decide what's a country. I don't want to decide who's in charge of the country. I'm going to the United Nations because they have a table of two character identifiers, which have been set up by the Statistics Office of the United Nations to keep track of countries and other areas of economic interest. So the Indian Ocean has .io, it's not a country. So John was very clever by saying, his idea was let somebody else make those hard decisions. Once you let me know what the symbols are, then we'll put them into the domain name system. What became dramatically interesting is that once it was possible to charge people for domain names, which was done in order to pay for the cost of managing the infrastructure of managing the domain name system. Then suddenly those names had value. And it's astonishing what happens in an environment where suddenly there is value present. People figure out ways of making money in ways that you never anticipated. They fight over all kinds of things. There is one big problem that the Patent and Trademark Office knows very well. Trademarks are not unique. You are allowed to have trademarks in different businesses. So the ABC Butter Company and the ABC Ski Manufacturing Company are distinguished by the fact that they may be called ABC, but they're in different businesses. And the expectation is people will not be confused. Domain names are unique. There's only one abc.com. You can't have two owners of abc.com. And so there is a tremendous conflict that's generated by that.
So I want to take a look forward and talk about what some of the most challenging things are. Have we solved it all? Should we just go home or take a look at challenge? But before I do, I'm dying to ask this question. So what was the biggest, oh my gosh, that didn't work? What you said, oh, we had email and we didn't think it was going to, we didn't even have a sense of email, but was there something that you were so sure this is it, and then you look back and you say, that just didn't work. Big mistake. Maybe there were none, but I'm dying to know if there was one big mistake.
Oh, Lordy, there are a lot more than one.
Okay, you only get one. Everybody only gets one
All right,
to think
well, I'll
of.
tell you the one that Bob Kahn and I made. We thought when we were doing the original internet design, we were trying to figure out, well, how big is this going to get? And we knew it was going to be used, well, we hoped it was going to be used for defense command and control. So we knew it had to work all over the world. And so we did a few back of the envelope calculations and guessed that we could build a system with a maximum number of terminations of 4.3 billion. And when you do the math, that's a 32-bit address space. And we thought, well, surely that's enough for an experiment. Remember, this calculation was done in 1973. Well, I thought that we would do the experiment, and if it all worked, we would then do a production version of the system. Unfortunately, in 1989, the experimental system became commercially available, and so it escaped from the lab. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, what's going to happen? And sure enough, around 1992, the Internet Engineering Task Force looks at the rapid proliferation of local area nets, thanks to Radia's, spanning tree protocols and everything, and realized that we're going to overflow the address space. So they worked together over a 4-year period to develop IP version 6, which has a 128-bit address. The math is 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses, 340 trillion addresses, which is a number only the Congress can appreciate. And so we thought, well, it would be instantly obvious that everyone would drop IP version 4, the 32-bit address space format, and immediately adopt IPv6. Well, they didn't do that because they hadn't run out of the old address space, and they didn't run out until 2011. Then we realized that, that people started to realize they have to implement IPv6. There are a bunch of other things that have happened. It has not propagated very quickly. 23 years since 1996, we only have about 30% penetration. The thing that will force IPv6 in the bigger address space is the mobile phones, of which there are several billion, and IoT, Internet of Things, devices that are programmable on the net. But if I could go back in time, I would have preferred not to have to make the transition because it's been so slow and painful.
Fair enough. Do you have another one, or I'm going to go on to?
No, go ahead. You said only
no,
one.
I
so.
meant to the other folks.
Oh, okay, all right.
Okay, well, I was so excited about the internet about 5 years ago, and now I think it's sort of going to be the death of civilization. I mean, before, like 5 years ago, I would have talked about how you can think of a product and have a worldwide audience without having to have a storefront. You can buy things from all that, all this, you can get information for free about anything. It's just astonishing. But the end of truth. So the way to know whether something's true is to be able to know that it came from a credible source. And if your source of news is the Channel 4 news, then sure, you could have that be, you can know that it came from Channel 4 news. But these days, everybody is a reporter, because Channel 4 News can't be every place where things are happening. So it's just ordinary people with a cell phone that take very important stuff and it spreads through the internet. But they can also input totally wrong things. And there's no way to tell whether things are true or not anymore. And this is just, terrifying. So, the internet was great. It had a great run. Yay, yay, but it's the end of civilization.
Okay. I don't know. I don't want to end this conversation, which has really been super fun.
Wait,
without some
can we
hope.
have a reclama? Steve, do you want to respond
but
to that?
I don't want to end on a downer.
Well, right.
Worrying about IP versions 4 to 6.
No, that's not what I was going to bring up.
And I don't want to worry about the downer parts. Where are the challenges? Well,
Radia just laid the challenge out. That challenge is that the benefit of the internet is that this enormous quantity of information that's available to us, tools to find it, Google and others. The big problem, and the thing that we all have a challenge to resolve, is how to distinguish good quality information, in fact, from that which is not. That's called critical thinking, and it takes a lot of work. And so it's the one thing that the price you pay for access to this open system is the work you have to put into it to distinguish quality information from poor quality information.
Right, so I'm not concerned about the people that do critical thinking and are willing to do the work. I'm concerned about the people who don't and do dangerous things as a result. And so there was a time when I was in college when I was kind of panicked about, all the interesting problems have already been solved. There won't be anything to do in graduate school and whatever because it'll all have been solved. But no, it's actually an immense amount of work. So yeah, there's the security stuff. There's the human component as well. How do you actually make it so that people can use this stuff and use it safely? Don't say things like humans shouldn't click on suspicious links. That's what the engineer says, and his job is done. But what's a link? What's a suspicious link? So how can we design these things to actually work? I mean, the internet has brought us this far, and it's teetering on the edge of disaster. But we need people to kind of solve all of these usability and security things to actually bring it into, not being a disaster and only being the wonderful thing that it has the potential of being.
So,
Yeah, let me
Go, Steve, please.
Let me chime in there and sort of pick up from the point where you're saying. We've talked a bit about the early days of the network as an experiment, and the early versions of the internet were intended to be a laboratory model and then it escaped and became the thing that we're all using. But in a real sense, it's still an experiment, and now it's an experiment not so much in the technology, although there's lots of technical issues that we could delve into, but it's an experiment in what happens when you connect more or less everybody who can say anything they want anytime they want. And the results are mixed at best, and one can focus on the negative aspects, which are quite manifest and quite severe, and I don't want to minimize that at all. But I don't think it's necessarily the case that things will only go downhill. I remain a bit hopeful that as a society, as a species, that we will learn and accommodate how to deal with this technology, and the pendulum will swing back so that we will become more sophisticated to some extent, more demanding to a certain extent. We will find a balance between regulation. I don't like regulation a whole lot, but it serves the purpose of providing some safety and some order versus the openness that is essential for the kind of society and democracy that we want to live in. So I don't know what the time frame is going to be. It's the hardest thing. It's like predicting the market. I don't know whether it's a 5-year problem or a 50-year problem, but I have the sense that all of the negative stuff that we are experiencing, you can view it in a slightly larger picture of what's the feedback loop going to be on that, what are the reactions going to be. And of course, some of the reactions you're hearing are quite draconian, but I suspect that there'll be a more sophisticated and more nuanced kind of reaction. There's plenty of opportunity from a research point of view for how do you design systems that are more predictable, or to explore what the consequences are going to be of large-scale design. Vint and Radia and I all grew up as computer scientists. I think more and more to be fully educated in computer science, one has to have access to the social science disciplines, economics and psychology and sociology and so forth, because we're building systems that are interacting with people and with people's behavior. And there is no such thing as a nice abstract design of a system with a spec that is easily provable. I mean, it's nice to design a square root algorithm and say, okay, we have to deal with all of the nuances of the arithmetic and so forth. But very few problems are that clean, and we're well into the area where people design systems that are being used by many, many people, and understanding what the behavior is going to be when arbitrary people come up. And so I'll just end with a little tiny thing that I shared with you, Shelley. I'm fond of saying that I've been working on this network stuff for 50 years, and I never really understood what it was all about. But now I do, because we have 3 young grandchildren. FaceTime with Grandma, FaceTime with Nana is what it's all about. But one of the things that has emerged quite unexpectedly is that our very young grandchildren, I'm talking about like year plus or minus, they take great delight in going up to the phone. They know that they're communicating and pressing the button that is the most obvious button to press. A big red button with a big X, and that's the end of the conversation. Over and over again. Yeah. And my son, finally pointed out that it's just a misdesign of the user interface. Right. Whoever anticipated that 1-year-old children were going to be the primary users of these systems?
So I just feel compelled, if you don't mind, just to say, I think every single person in this room will have done something useful on the internet today and will recognize its utility. So our big challenge is making sure that we increase that utility and we decrease some of the abusive behaviors. One last point for the students in this room, we were all young once, in case you don't quite believe that. And a lot of what we were doing, we were your age when we were doing it. So there's still plenty to do, and you can still do it.
So I don't want to stop the conversation. I really want to expand the conversation. So this is the chance now for the next times for the audience to ask their questions of you. And there should be a few people with microphones, though I can't quite see.
Yes, the microphones are in the back.
Microphones, and I also see hands.
Yes, so we need to get microphones and hands together.
Let's start with one right here in the front. This gentleman, I'm trying not to point. There you go. And why don't you tell us who you are?
Sure. Ted Heisey. I'm from Indiana. I just happened to be in town for some standards development work and was able to squeeze this in before going back to the airport. Great discussion. Thank you. About 20 years ago, I decided I wanted to set up my own domain as a hobby. I wanted my last name as the domain, and the .com was gone, the .org was gone.
Right.
I've discovered this whole domain that was property of the island of Niue.
Oh, yes,
I was
right,
just talking about it.
right.
So I paid a little extra and I got that domain name. And I found out a few years later that there was some controversy about the management of the proceeds from that domain name.
Right.
And I actually traced it through the New Zealand court system, and I'm not sure whatever came of it, but I'm wondering, is ICANN set up in a way that it can deal
It would be,
responsibly and ethically and fairly with these types of issues, or is that going to have to fall to some other larger organization?
You realize that both Vint and I served terms in the sense of serving time in prison as chairman of the board of ICANN for several years each.
and we don't have that job anymore, so go ask somebody else. The honest answer is that for domain names that are top level and country codes, that the responsibility in general lies with the country. So ICANN does not dictate to countries about how they behave in their internal affairs. That was another brilliant move by Postel, right, when he handed this responsibility for defining who is responsible for top level domain if it's a country code. So the answer is dealing with the New Zealand courts is the right place to be.
So we have a young person in here, right, second row. Do you see her?
My name is Bonnie Bracy Sutton.
Hi, Bunny.
That's my friend. I'm worrying about teachers. I'm a teacher. I've learned everything I can from these guys. But teachers in the classroom in different states, sometimes it's the fact that they're learning 6 different standards, but not any content. Sometimes it's the fact that there's the internet, the outer net, and the games that people play. And I don't see the quality. So I think that's, how do we get the teachers or the people who are working with youth to use the internet correctly and not as a toy?
Yeah, so something that's very important to teach people is that not everything you read is true. So, like you can get 2 different books that say different things, or you can find 7 different things on the internet that all say different things. So coping with that when you can't answer a simple question, when I was in school, a lot of tests were multiple choice. There was a right and a wrong. So in these days, given that there's so many different sources of information, a lot of which are wrong, how to get them to sort of sort through that is an incredibly important issue.
A 4th grade child who learns how to use the internet and the computer will look a teacher in the eye and know if they don't know what they're talking about.
So could I try to respond at least
Please.
in one way? Everyone in this room, I hope, appreciates the scientific method. That method says you have a theory. You use the theory to compose or concoct an experiment to test whether the theory makes good predictions. And when you run the experiment and it doesn't comply with the predictions, you first test to make sure your experiment was properly done and didn't have a mistake in measurement. And if it turns out that the measurements don't match the theory, if you're a good scientist, you will adapt the theory to match the measurements. That scientific method is exactly the kind of critical thinking that you want people to apply. In order to answer Bonnie's question, the best thing I can say is that the teachers have to grow up with the internet and learn and understand what its weaknesses and frailnesses are, just as Radio was outlining. My guess is that generationally speaking, eventually all the teachers will have grown up with internet and they will have understood what its strengths and weaknesses are. For those who didn't grow up with it, which might still be a significant part of our teaching population, we do have to recognize the problem that Bonnie raises and do something about in-service training so they understand more about how to use the internet in an effective way.
Fair enough. Somebody on the aisle here on this side. See him?
Hello, my name is Philip. I'm a student at GW. I'm studying
Philip.
international affairs and computer science, actually.
Great.
So my question is kind of policy related. So recently we've seen Apple in China blacklisting VPNs and removing maps used by Hong Kong protesters at the Chinese government's request. And we've also seen Google working on a Chinese government-censored search engine called Project Dragonfly, which was actually pulled last year due to public outcry. So my question is, do you think that we will continue to see tech companies cooperate with internet censorship of the Chinese government in order to do business there? And if so, do you see this as a problem?
So I'm happy to try to respond to
Okay.
part of that. We are not doing Dragonfly, and the report from our CEO, Sundar, is that the project has been abandoned. You do remember we pulled out of China in 2010 when we discovered they had attacked and managed to penetrate into our system. To answer your question, it's a very difficult business question for somebody who's looking at something like 1/7 of the world's population or more as a potential business area. You can't just shut your eyes to that. The question is, how do you do business given the constraints that the Chinese government and other governments have placed on business people? So they're not the only place where this is a conundrum. I think that you're going to find people wanting to solve that problem. Maybe part of it is successful negotiations with the Chinese government about what's acceptable. But as you know from your own studies, there's a fairly big boundary between the Chinese internet and the rest of the world. Some people are describing the Chinese internet as not the internet, but China AOL. As you remember, AOL was a closed garden, and that's what the Chinese internet is looking like.
So,
Go ahead.
Please,
yeah,
go right.
you know, we're supposed to say censorship is completely bad, but who are we to really say that? And so should we say that China is not allowed on the internet because they want to be able to censor certain stuff, so therefore, because they want to do that, we won't give them any information at all? It's actually a very difficult question. So, Steve?
Yeah, I think that you wouldn't find any disagreement among any of us, and probably nobody in the room, about wanting the kind of society that we have in the U.S., more or less, where things tend to be open, although things are getting a little sticky. But rather than thinking of this as to how we're going to use the internet to cause other people, other societies, other countries to change the way they think, I think that is a little on the presumptuous side. We're living in a world that has evolved over many centuries with different societies, different standards, different values, and different fundamental philosophies about the right way to organize things. And what the internet, the role that the internet plays in all of this is that it is bringing some of the differences in values into sharper relief and posing some problems at the boundaries, so to speak. This will take some time to work out. It may take a long time to work out. I don't anticipate that the internet is going to be the solution to problems that have existed for many, many centuries prior to the internet and are ongoing quite vigorous competitions for attention and primacy in this world. So I think one's got to dial back a little bit, and you have the economic issues, the realities of trying to do business around the world, which is certainly an important aspect. But even if you take that out of it, I don't think that you would really want to be able to enforce particular philosophies across all societies and say, you know, we know the right way to do things and we want everybody to do it our way. The results of that might be even worse than what we see now.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Fair enough. Let's see, I can't see if there's somebody towards the back. I'm sorry, sir, but there's somebody a little further to the back, that's sort of in the middle of a row. I see a hand. Yep.
There's no person, there's just
There's
a hand.
just a hand,
standing there.
right? Talk to the hand.
Yeah.
All right, thank you guys for coming here. My name's Gregor. I'm an undergrad here, and I thought it was interesting. You guys were talking about like RFCs and the early development of the internet, even across like international borders. You're kind of seeing that like the genesis of like open source software development. So I wonder if you guys have any like thoughts on open source and where it's going in the next 10 years or so. Thank you.
So open source has really been an extraordinary transition, because software for a long time was considered a very proprietary thing. In fact, there were mechanisms allowing people to patent software, which has its upsides and downsides. What's happened is that open source has become a powerful tool for sharing of knowledge and permitting people to build and piggyback on other people's developments. It has a downside, however, and that downside is that when everybody is in charge, nobody's in charge. And there's assumptions that are made about this open source software, about its correctness, about its vulnerabilities or lack of vulnerabilities and the like. You run into this problem where people are building a product, they go out to GitHub or some other open source place, they grab an operating system and throw it into the product, thinking, well, everybody's had a chance to look at the code, so it must be okay, which turns out to be wrong. And so, in a way, the open source model, which has been very powerful, has also introduced a great deal of insecurity and vulnerability into this growing infrastructure of software that we're all depending on. And I think that's going to be a transformative recognition. I think that we're going to end up with open source systems that have a heck of a lot more attention being paid to the safety, security, reliability, and resistance to attack of the software that's in those systems. And the people who offer software that have those characteristics are likely to be the ones who are most successful.
Yeah, so the commercial software that I run has never had any bugs in it. I'm
Right.
kidding, right.
Yeah, I hope you're kidding.
Yes,
Either
yes.
that or I want to know who you're buying it from.
Right. But the other comment about that was it used to be that in order to kind of influence the world, you had to do it through the standards bodies. But the standards bodies are very political, and there's multiple competing standards bodies, and they're slow. Another way to influence the world is actually open source, that you do it, you do something, and it becomes the way things are. So that question may have had something to do with that.
I mean, look, okay, so there's a young woman over here wearing a yellow scarf. Okay.
Hello, my name is Kalisha. I'm a GW alum. I currently work for State Department. So first, I just want to say thank you all for your incredible contributions to our modern world. My question is sort of geopolitical, hence my background, but just from your perspective, I know you guys definitely could not have anticipated the scale of the internet and how much of the modern economy depends on the internet working. And so my question is, what has shocked you the most in terms of how countries have been able to weaponize the internet to do certain things? And so I'm thinking specifically of Russia taking down the Georgian internet for a couple days, I think, or even just the Great Firewall of China. I've heard many people say they didn't think it was possible to create a system like that on a national scale. So I'm just curious, from your perspective, what has surprised you the most?
Well, things like having bots that reply on message boards and stuff. So it looks like millions of people all believe this whatever kind of thing, or just injecting bad information, being sort of very, very clever about exactly who's likely to be influenced by what stories. It's quite frightening.
Steve, did you want to?
I think this is kind of an instance of the internet becoming big enough and ubiquitous enough that sort of the old saw is war is too important to be left to the generals. The modern version of the internet's too important to be left to the technical people. I was in had a very nice visit in a country in Latin America, and one of the most senior people in the government worked directly for the president of the country, sort of hijacked me for a couple of hours, and one of the lines that I remember from our conversation, he says, the internet's become important, and what we are concerned with in government is power, and so we need to control, we need to be involved, we need to understand and be involved with the internet. I thought, well, I'm not sure whether I like this or I don't like this, but I think he was speaking an obvious truth. And whether it's Russia or whether it's a country more aligned with the U.S. or Western values. I think it's all the same, and I think it's even the same here. It's a tool, and it's embedded deeply in our every aspect of our society, but it's a tool that then becomes an attraction for people who are concerned with how do I exercise control over their own population, over other populations, over interactions with other nations.
Or if not control, at least influence. Well, this gets back to critical thinking, for one thing, wanting to teach people how to react to bad quality information. I see only 3 ways to deal with the problems that you're describing. The first one is to use technical means to inhibit whatever the bad behavior or bad consequence is. That's why you want more reliable and more secure software. That's why you want end-to-end encryption. You want a lot of other things. But that doesn't solve all the problems. The next thing that you have to say is that if there is bad behavior or harmful behavior on the net, then there needs to be a way to detect that and to respond to it. And so this is post-hoc enforcement. You say to people, if we catch you doing these things, our society considers them wrong, and there will be consequences. It's sort of like being caught driving without a seatbelt and being told if you're caught that way, there will be consequences. But that is not a guarantee either. We won't catch everybody who does something wrong. And it's particularly more complicated when whatever the wrong thing is across international boundaries. The only other thing I can think of is a kind of moral suasion where you just tell people, don't do that, it's wrong. And although that sounds wimpy, I draw your attention to the weakest force in the universe called gravity. And it is the weakest force of all the 4 forces we know about. And yet, gravity holds the Earth in orbit around the sun and holds us onto the planet. And so if you think about moral suasion for a moment, if you think of a large enough people who adopt particular norms of behavior in their society, that exerts quite a powerful influence on people. But those are the only 3 things I can think of that we can exercise in order to cope with the problem that you're describing.
So we have a gentleman down here in the 2nd row. Thanks, Pat.
Hi, my name is Vinay Nagpal, and I'm with Globics. This has been a great discussion. Thank you, everyone, for who's involved in organizing it, and to all the people here. I've had the honor and the privilege of working with Vint Cerf about 20 years back at MCI, and more recently now at the Henrico County Richmond NAP. Recently I heard a statistic that 90% of all the data that exists today was created in the last 2 years. So it made me think that, what the coming times hold for us in terms of the amount of data that's generated. So my question is, when we look at technologies like autonomous cars, connected cars, IoT, connected homes, everything, involves transfer of data. Is the internet as it exists today from an infrastructure perspective robust enough to sustain that growth of data that lies ahead of us? And if not, what is being done about it, or what can be done about it?
I can't resist.
Okay.
Do you remember?
Well, then don't resist.
Yeah. Well, you remember what Bob Metcalfe, our dear friend who was one of the inventors of Ethernet, in his early days as a publisher, announced that there was going to be a gigalapse, that the internet was going to collapse because of all the traffic that was on it. Now, that didn't actually happen because as the traffic went up, new technologies came along, optical fiber technologies like what your company is concerned with, to increase the capacity. The computers ran faster, the clock speeds went up. So far, we've been able to keep up somehow. And every time we do something to increase capacity, people find a way to use it, which is why a lot of you are doing streaming video now, which we could certainly not have done during the Arpanet period, where our backbone speed was 50 kilobits a second. So I'm not too concerned at this point about the capacity. I am worried, however, about the information that's being accumulated, and I do worry about whether it will still be around 100 years from now. This is a digital dark age preservation of digital content worry that I have. Simple question, how many people here still have 3.5-inch floppy disks or 5.25-inch floppy disks, and they're gathering dust in the closet, and you can't find a reader that can read them? And even if you could, it'll have stuff in a format for which there's no software that knows how to interpret it. That's the bigger problem with the data that I worry about.
Fair enough. Steve, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I'll pass.
You're going to stick?
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. We have time for a couple of more questions. Sir, just have to wait for a mic.
My name is Pedro Vicente. I'm a software engineer, and I write internet applications. So I have a I have a very technical question, of course. It's about the TCP/IP protocol, and so basically, this protocol just allows for two computers to send bytes from one computer to another, and this is a problem I face often. Is how do you not exactly a problem, but it's just a feature, let's say. So the question is, would you design the protocol differently today than when you wrote it? So the problem is basically I send the byte to another computer, but the other computer doesn't know if there more data or not to receive. And just for information, because of this problem or feature, we have to write protocols on top of TCP/IP that tells us basically, okay, no more data here. That's basically how the World Wide Web works, because Tim Berners-Lee wrote a protocol saying, okay, no more data, and now that's how we download our page, or web page, and can see the page.
Okay.
So that's basically the question. So I actually have a personal web page that has that picture, and in that page I say that maybe 50 or 100 years from now, the internet will be viewed as probably the biggest invention of the last century, maybe bigger than the automobile or nuclear energy.
Okay,
So
we're not going to get into the details of the TCP/IP protocol in the middle of everything, but I would like to urge you to go have a look at a different protocol called QUIC, Q-U-I-C. It is an evolution beyond TCP/IP, and it has got features in it that I think you'll like. So have a look at that, Q-U-I-C.
And actually, the actual protocols are not that important. It's sort of like English is a lousy language, but it works. And so there's lots of things perhaps that could have been done slightly better or whatever, but it works. Yeah, so that's how I would answer that.
What do you mean the protocols aren't important?
Yeah.
He's Mr. Protocol sitting right next to you.
Well, you know, they could have been done in lots of different ways as long as they work. So, you know, like English works, Italian works, German works. You could complain about various things, you know, like Dutch has way too many consonants for some reason. But, you know, like these variations are not as important as sort of the bigger picture.
Fair enough. So I think we have time for maybe two more questions. Let's see.
There are lots
There's
way
a young
over there.
woman, just wave your hand violently back and forth and he'll see you. Fair enough.
So the violent gentleman in the fifth row, right?
The violent gentleman, no, it's the violent woman.
Hi, I'm Natasha. I'm from UCLA, actually. Thank you so much for speaking here and also agreeing to attend the Internet 50th anniversary. Professor Kleinrock happens to be my mentor, so I speak on his behalf when when I say we're very thankful that you are agreeing to speak there. So my question pertains to blockchain, actually. So blockchain has been hailed as the future, as the next internet. So I wanted to ask you guys, like, how true do you think this statement is? And also, what kind of advice you would give as founders of the internet to early adopters and innovators of blockchain or any other emerging technology?
Run the other way.
Right. Yeah, I've been trying to tell that, right. Yeah, there is so much hype about blockchain. So people kind of made money on Bitcoin and also...
Or didn't.
Right, or didn't.
Right.
But the more hype there is, the more money they make. And the more hype, the more a venture capitalist will throw money at you if you claim that your shoelaces are blockchain enabled or whatever. Yeah, so there's a bunch of misleading statements people say, like, oh, look how many applications I can build on blockchain. And if you assume that it's a black box with an API for I can store data and I can retrieve data, yes, you could build lots of things on it, but you could also have used a disk or a cloud much more efficiently. So I urge people to know what problem you're solving. Don't say, how can I use blockchain? But start with, what problem are you solving? Look at different solutions. And it's very hard to find anything that actually blockchain is the right solution. Now, I had some engineers come up to me and say, oh, but management really wants me to build on blockchain. And so I tell them, fine, my advice to you is still do the right thing, find out what problem you're solving, look at different things, implement the right thing, and then call it blockchain.
Just tell them that you use blockchain. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. So, okay, the last question right here.
Thank you so much for giving the talk. It was extremely enlightening and delightful. My name is Eugene. I'm a software engineer that's local to DC. My question pertains to spam and also encryption. So as we have noticed, privacy is becoming more and more important on the internet, and so encryption is on the rise. However, if you start encrypting everything, then suddenly nobody but the sender and the recipient can read the communication, which is a problem when it comes to spam, battling spam, because at this point, all of it is done via filters, which basically implies that the ISP, the internet provider, can read your email and then sort out what is good and what is not good. So if you have any insight into that particular dilemma, I would be delighted to hear it. Thank you so much.
Well, that's an interesting question. It depends a lot on how this gets implemented, how the encryption is implemented. If the encryption is done as part of the, let's say it's an email system, and the provider of email has access to the key and can undo it for the user, then you can still apply some of the anti-spam mechanisms. If the user has to take an action in order to decrypt the communication, then you're quite right. In theory, nobody else can see it. Now, I do not think, by the way, that that line of reasoning suggests that we should build backdoors into encryption or anything. That's a really terrible idea. So my guess is that for certain kinds of communication that people wish to remain confidential, but who are willing to allow the provider of the email service to decrypt, that the problem will not be too bad. For those communications where you absolutely do not want any help and must take an action in order to decrypt, what you kind of hope is that there will be fewer and fewer of those to be worried about. One thing that can happen is that the source of the message could now become an important indicator for the filters. And now we have to start thinking about whitelisting and being able to say, I'm only willing to listen to encrypted information from the following parties, assuming a small number of people you would want to engage that way. I think there are ways to hack this problem, but it's an interesting one.
The post office, the U.S. Post Office, set rates on mail long before the internet, anything, and they gave a discount to people who were sending advertising that you didn't want to get. I'm sorry, they set a discount on advertising that businesses wanted to send you.
Yes.
And what I'm deliberately pointing out is that there's a difference in motivation between the person who wants to send it and the person who may or may not want to receive it. One of the features that may have been a big mistake is that when the mail protocol was set up, there was zero cost to sending a message effectively. Mm-hmm. And that leads directly to the spam situation that we have today. So one could imagine maybe making some changes in that. There might, we should put a cost of sending or a requirement that the sender be identified as Vint was suggesting. So you could imagine making some change of that. You mentioned encryption. The usual issue about encryption is not so much spam, but more serious kinds of things. Kiddie porn being the sort of at the high end of the spectrum of things that everybody thinks are really terrible and and so forth. I've had some conversations with people who are actively and seriously engaged with fighting that sort of crime. And the enlightened answer is that rather than trying to outlaw use of encryption or put government controls in there, is that you do old-fashioned police work. You get inside of the environments that generate that, and you become as good as they are at dealing with that.
So,
By
my
the way,
sons were. Go
I'm sorry
ahead.
to interrupt.
Sure. No.
No, I'm just thinking about the fact that there was a big kiddie porn ring that was broken recently. That was done by exactly what Steve is describing, old-fashioned police work getting inside. Sorry, I just wanted.
Not a problem. My sons are right. This was a great evening. I've enjoyed it a lot. I hate to be the one to bring it to a close, but it's not exactly a close. We're going to adjourn for a reception, one flight up. So before we adjourn, I hope you will join me in thanking our three speakers.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
And if the three speakers would like to thank the provocative questions, that too. Okay, one flight up.
Okay.